Joining me now from Dunsville, Virginia, presidential historian, Reagan biographer, and New York Times best-selling author Craig Shirley. Craig, the news conference is not a constitutional requirement, the presidential news conference. Of course, the State of the Union is a constitutional requirement under Article 2, Section 3. It's now officially back on, thanks to the wonderful and talented Nancy Pelosi. She was really trying to have a slap at the President of the United States, I think, my interpretation of what she was doing here by postponing the State of the Union during the shutdown. But in reality, when you step back, Craig, and you look at the big picture, this was a slap at us, we the people. This delivery system, this State of the Union is for us. It's not for Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, that's a great point, Graham. This is that it's become so wrapped up in Washington, so wrapped up in the tit for tat and the give and take, is that they forget that there are real lives and real people. There's over 300 million American people who want to know about the State of the Union, and it goes back all the way to George Washington's time. It wasn't always delivered in person, and it wasn't always televised, but the president always delivered it. This is the first time it's been delayed for it's never been postponed or canceled. Never been canceled. This is the first time it's been delayed for so long. So it's a tragic sort of thing.
And to your point, just to punctuate it, the Constitution is rather vague as to the State of the Union, right? I mean, it could be, it was delivered in writing in the past. It has been delivered in many forms. But recently speaking, it is certainly not in the Constitution, but it has become a tradition that the president addresses a joint session of Congress.
Yes. The Constitution simply said the president shall from time to time give a report to Congress. And that, like everything else, bureaucracy takes hold, and then that metamorphosed into an annual address by the president, which everybody in Washington looks forward to. It's they're really unremarkable. They're unmemorable. It's a political show with the president coming down the aisle and then the response by the opposing party. But like Jimmy Carter in '77 didn't give a televised State of the Union address. Of course, he'd already lost to Reagan. It was kind of embarrassing because Reagan was waiting there in Washington, ready to be sworn in. So Carter sent a handwritten, or not a handwritten note, but a written State of the Union. And then, of course, Gerald Ford, he merged his last State of the Union in '77 with his farewell address. And usually, really, the farewell addresses for some presidents like Washington, Eisenhower, and Reagan are far more interesting and far more memorable than their State of the Union addresses.
I have a feeling this February 5 State of the Union from this president is going to be memorable for one reason or another. And the bottom line is I think history will prove that Nancy Pelosi was playing politics with this originally scheduled State of the Union in January. Monday, though, Craig, was the first presidential news conference, not by the president, but by his administration, the first one in 41 days. And the president offered an explanation as to why that Sarah Sanders basically was being beat up by the mainstream media. This is interesting. Woodrow Wilson was the first president to have a news conference, and the first televised was, a lot of people think it was Kennedy, but it wasn't. It was Eisenhower, wasn't it?
That's right. It was Eisenhower. And Wilson was the first one to have regular press conferences. And the press secretary is a relatively new phenomenon in the American experience. I think Franklin Roosevelt was the first one. Daily press briefings weren't a regular phenomenon, but that's evolved over time. But for instance, like on December 7th, 1941, Stephen Early, who was Franklin Roosevelt's press secretary, had something like a dozen different press conferences just on that one day to update reporters on what was going on in Pearl Harbor, with updated press briefings, press statements, and what was going on in the Pacific. So, but it's evolved over the years into now it started being televised under Clinton. It was never televised before. It was relatively routine, event with the press secretary announcing the president's movements of the day, who was meeting with, what ambassador. It took on some more interest when Ron Nesson was press secretary during Watergate. But it's been a relatively routine affair up until recently, when it's taken on more importance and more media attention.
And to the president's point, it is a sign of the times that he has to pull his press secretary back and say, hey, you know what? I don't want you to take these arrows anymore. The partisan nature, and it really is a partisan nature of the White House press corps, is hard to ignore now versus, even in the Dan Rather days when he would get up there and ask these pointed questions of Richard Nixon, there was always a modicum of respect.
Want to see more videos like this? Click on the link below and subscribe to One American News on YouTube, and call your cable provider and kindly demand that One American News is added to your lineup. Call and subscribe today.